Of all the objections to Christianity, one that I've always found interesting is the boring afterlife. This objection doesn't seek to disprove Christianity as a fact of the matter, but rather tries to paint it as something undesirable. Critics who use this objection opine that a life that comes to a preferred end is better than a life that is forced to exist perpetually. This objection, at its core, is saying that the life that we experience, the life that we understand, is not worth existing forever. And that if heaven is anything like it is here, then that life also would not be worth living forever. This is the issue that the YouTuber Duncan Clark had in his Heaven Afterlife tier list. He worried that the experience of eternity, no matter how many things that you do in there, will eventually get boring. And I use the word experience here purposely. Not life, but experience. Because I think that he correctly understands that experiences can continue to be novel, but life, which implies a continued experience, not a refreshed experience, would then be a bit more undesirable. This is why he has less of an issue with stuff like the infinite loop or reincarnation. This is because while you're technically living forever, you are experiencing an infinite number of new things. Or at least ostensibly infinite, which I'll get into later. This keeps you engaged and interested and never bored. Because even though there's some kind of ethereal consciousness that exists in perpetuity, it experiences a sort of refresh where everything still feels new, even if technically speaking, according to this view, according to the views that he espouses, they aren't actually new. Thus, in order to properly engage with this objection, as he articulates in his video, we have to articulate, or at least attempt to articulate, a kind of experience that will be worth experiencing forever. That's even kind of softening it a bit. Not just worth experiencing, but would be preferable to experience forever. Before we continue, let's actually look at what Duncan says about heaven.
Ranking heaven in a video like this is a little tricky. Religions that describe a heavenly realm are usually pretty vague about what it's actually like there. It's described as this perfect, beautiful place, with no pain and suffering, where we can live in bliss and worship God for eternity. But is this kind of immortality something we actually want? At a certain point, there might not actually be anything interesting for existence to give you. You wouldn't be deprived of anything. Imagine a classic idea of heaven. We all turn into angels and spend eternity singing psalms together or something. Singing psalms is probably pretty fun to do for a while, but doing that for all of eternity seems a little excessive. What kind of life would be worth living forever? This isn't just 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, or 1,000,000,000 years. This existence has no end. There are some things I love doing. Eating lamb vindaloo, solving Minesweeper puzzles, listening to Beach House, whatever. But after the first 100,000 years of doing that, it would probably get a bit stale.
I think the problem with Duncan's approach is that he assumes that the heaven experience is identical to the earthly experience. And similar to that, he assumes that the things in heaven are same in quantity and quality as they are on earth. So like the Bible doesn't really talk about heaven all that much, at least in any specific detail, but I think that there's some things that we can surmise about it. In our temporal lives, I believe that we can at least get a small treat of what heaven is like. In the Bible, it often talks about the peace of God that comes with the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the third member of the Trinity that is in all of us. So in a very literal sense, we are getting a sort of taste of God. And the Bible describes it, specifically in Philippians 4 verse 7, I believe, that it is a peace that surpasses all understanding. And again, this is an ethereal peace that we can experience thanks to the Holy Spirit. It is beyond any experience that we can glean just by looking at our brains or looking within ourselves. This peace will be with us in a much more full sense and in perpetuity when we are in heaven. The philosopher Peter Kreeft had a funny analogy. He sort of compares heaven to sex. Pause, let me elaborate. When answering the question of whether there will be sex in heaven, he basically equates it to whether you'll be wanting to eat candy when having sex. Point being, you won't want to eat candy. Now, the specific example isn't actually even that accurate if you ask me, but the idea is true. The experience in heaven will be of such a different magnitude that whatever the greatest pleasures or satisfactions you can have on earth will look laughable. In heaven, you'll look at every time you sinned and think, really? I decided to do that instead of pursuing this? Even the genuine suffering you face will begin to feel like nothing. G.K. Chesterton believed that joy was the deepest experience. There is no suffering, no pain, no sorrow that can ever reach the depths or lengths that joy can. And that's because the most true and authentic reality in existence is God, who is joy and goodness himself. We won't be married in heaven, but if you ask any happily married couple who's especially been happily married for a long time, they'll say that their marriage brings them some sort of joy that is ineffable. But when you're in heaven, you will have such a joy of being in the presence of God that your relationship with your wife will look like a crusty, stale piece of bread compared to a 5-star dish. Many Christians don't really look forward to heaven, at least they don't look for it in the way that they look forward to like a long night's rest after a hard day's work, but that's because they don't really understand how insipid our lives really are. I've been injured for maybe a year and a half at this point, and this puts me in an interesting position because I have a deep longing and, most importantly, appreciation for physical well-being, much more than probably 90% of people do. In heaven, I can at least be sure that my shoulder and hip, insofar as I'll have something like a shoulder and a hip, will be healed. But not just healed, but supercharged. I will function the way that I ought to in heaven. I will be more of myself in heaven, in a teleological sense. Teleology is just a fancy way of saying our designated, natural, God-given ends, or rather our pursuit of that end. The idea of even getting my current shoulder and hip healed to the point where it was before is something I greatly anticipate. It's been injured for so long that I don't even remember what it's even like to have it functioning properly. Something like that is similar in heaven. It's like your entire body has been injured this entire time, and you don't even realize it because it's just been the natural state for so long, that one day someone just magically heals it and you realize, wait, this is what I'm supposed to be the entire time. And then you work out, and then you supercharge your shoulders, biceps, triceps, core, legs, hips, everything, and you feel so much better that you couldn't even conceptualize how good it felt to be this way until you actually got there. Something similar to that happens in heaven, times infinity. You can't understand the peace and joy that awaits you in heaven, similar to how I can't even understand how it's like to have a proper hip. Okay, I'll stop talking about my injury and traumatic car crash now. Heaven is supposed to be like joyful and not making you guys all sad. I'll use another metaphor. Try and think about a color that you've never seen before. Can't think about it? Well, there actually are more colors that we can't see. If you don't know, humans only have 3 cones which detect color. The mantis shrimp, however, has 16 color receptive cones. This means that scientifically, it can detect 5 times more color than a human. If you've ever liked looking at anything in your life, if you had the eyes of a mantis shrimp, that view will be multiplied times 5. We can't even fathom what this mantis shrimp is seeing. Now, given this information, take the fact that in our earthly nature, we are actually closer to a shrimp than we are to our heavenly selves, and you'll realize this just gets multiplied by infinity. Because even just our heavenly eyes are infinitely above our earthly existence, especially given a long enough time period of continual glorification. That shrimp that you may now envy thanks to my descriptions would be blinded the moment it came into heaven, as it fails to even contemplate the infinite spectrum of visuals that heaven can house. Now expand that not just to your eyes, but to all of your other body parts. Crazy, right? But now expand that beyond your body parts and into everything that you love. That coffee that you long for in the morning will be coffee-er. That view you see at the top of a mountain will be even more viewful and mountainer. Another way to put it for not just my lifting fans, but my gaming fans, is that imagine you're a 2D Mario or Sonic character, and now suddenly you get introduced to the 3rd dimension and you're literally in a dimension that you couldn't even conceive of before. Heaven is like being in that 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th, 20th infinity dimension.
Alright, but maybe instead of having to try to do interesting things or entertain yourself, you just experience complete bliss for eternity. Maximum pleasure. This seems appealing at first, but it also reminds me of something. There was a study where they attached electrodes to a rat's brain that released an intense burst of pleasure. They hooked this up to a button that the rat could press whenever it wanted. As you might expect, the rat just sat there pressing the button over and over until it died. But I'm not a rat, I'm a human. And it might sound arrogant, but I somehow feel like I'm above that kind of thing. I'd probably really enjoy the intense bliss for the first few thousand years. But then I'd start to think to myself, is this all there is?
There's another objection I hear about heaven that is kind of mentioned in this video, but not really, but I hear it enough, so I think it's worth investing time into. A lot of the joy from the human experience comes from building up desires, working through them, and then ultimately fulfilling them. Humanity is in a state of constant tug of war, where we build up desires only to satisfy them. But in heaven, there won't be any desires. At least no desires that we can't have immediately satisfied, which seems to take away the work that was required to get it, which we've come to know is actually part of the process of getting the fulfillment. In essence, heaven, as it is often conceived, seems to strip away the very challenges and triumphs that give meaning to our existence, leaving us in a state of perpetual contentment, devoid of the richness and depth that define our lives on Earth. I don't exactly agree with this view, or at least part of this conception of heaven. There's debates about whether we will be working in heaven, as heaven seems to be some sort of new Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve are tasked with subduing the earth as their first commandment even before the fall, which would require some kind of work and duty, so people question, are we going to be working in heaven? So the idea of us just singing Kumbaya and all our desires being immediately fulfilled just by thinking it, at least under that view, would not be true. Perhaps we'll be working there, perhaps we won't. That isn't necessarily what I'm interested in talking about right now. I'm more interested in analyzing the spiritual implications of an immortal soul. Our souls are in a perpetual state of desire. Heaven, then, is the fruit of a life's worth of longing for him. The satisfaction of heaven will retain and magnify the dynamism and history of us going there. We have the same soul, but it will be purified upon entering heaven. I believe that everyone has a nascent desire for something beyond themselves in this life. But we're stupid and desire things that aren't of God for the time being. In heaven, all of our desire will not just be transferred to God, but be multiplied in pursuit of God. In Muscular Christianity, A Case for Spiritual and Physical Fitness, my book, which you can get in the description, talks about this in chapter 7. Everything atheists pursue is finite, and their human desires may eventually supersede what is available. God, however, is far beyond anything we can create or any hobby we can partake in. Therefore, obsessing over God is actually a good obsession because God brings infinite fulfillment to our infinite longing. And the more we long for him, the more he will fulfill us.
Okay, well let's say you take a different approach, and you try to make the most of your time. You spend 1,000 years writing novels, 1,000 years painting. You learn how to play every single instrument at an expert level. You will always run out of things to do. At some point, you will have done it all. You might be able to fix this problem with some kind of amnesia system. Let's say you get bored after about 1,000 years of doing stuff. At this point, you start to lose your memories and forget what you did a few hundred years ago. By the time you're at 2 billion years, you could barely remember what you spent your time doing as a young 100 million year old angel. At this point, you've changed completely. You have different tastes, a different personality, and you spend your time doing things that you wouldn't imagine doing before. But is this really worth it? There is continuity between the young angel me and the old angel me, but is it still really me? I don't even remember the previous me existing at all. My personality is totally different too, and I'm probably hanging out with different angel friends. I don't think I'd want something like this.
Now, I've talked about how Duncan conflates the human experience with that of heaven, but that's not all. In heaven, the experiences won't just be of a greater quality, they won't just be infinitely of a greater magnitude than our understanding, but they will be infinitely diverse. There will be an infinite quantity of things. It will be more diverse, there'll be more multiplicity to that experience in heaven than every person's experience put together. In my book, again, I get at this idea. I say that God's glory is like an iridescent crystal with infinite sides. When you first lift the crystal, you look at it from one angle and are made privy to his infinite majesty. Then you turn the crystal ever so slightly and see another angle. This angle highlights another side of God's glory, yet it looks nothing like the previous side. It captures a part of God's glory that is from a completely different perspective. You turn the crystal again and see a third side of God's glory in an entirely new perspective, completely different in kind to the first 2 times. And you can continue doing this for an infinite number of times. The things of his house in heaven are very much similar. So I actually agree that if we were to merely do earthly things as we understand them, then heaven would get boring. But I don't think that that's all there is to heaven. What we desire will be purified in a greater version and greater quantity of the good things that we experience on earth. And these things will be continually and infinitely revealed to us. Again, the things will be of infinite quantity and infinite quality. Now this sounds very pleasurable, but at some point, right, just having a bunch of pleasure doesn't really sound all that nice. Duncan addresses that in his video where he talks about the study with a bunch of electrodes on the rats.
There was a study where they attached electrodes to a rat's brain that released an intense burst of pleasure. They hooked this up to a button that the rat could press whenever it wanted. As you might expect, the rat just sat there pressing the button over and over until it died. But I'm not a rat, I'm a human. And it might sound arrogant, but I somehow feel like I'm above that kind of thing. I'd probably really enjoy the intense bliss for the first few thousand years, but then I'd start to think to myself, is this all there is?
I agree actually that if heaven was just some satisfaction dopamine machine that we press forever, that would be pretty lame. But heaven isn't just a place of pleasure, but a place of purified fulfillment. Your pleasures ebb and flow and wane and rise all the time. But what you are fulfilled by, truly fulfilled by, is much more steady. It's not just a lasting feeling, but it's much more substantive. There's a difference in the pleasure you get when eating a nice chocolate and the fulfillment you get watching your daughter get married. One is much more substantive and durable than the other. We are more than dopamine and opiate neurotransmitter response creatures. If you take the current dopamine levels of a middle-aged man who's eating chocolate but has done nothing in his life up to that point, and compare it to a middle-aged man who isn't eating chocolate but feels fulfillment from his job and has climbed Mount Everest, the latter person will be much more fulfilled even if his dopamines aren't as high at that moment. We will repeatedly have those kind of experiences, only they will be repeatedly stacked on top of each other as we get closer in communion to the source of goodness, yet never fully reaching it. Here's another part of my book that gets at this idea, which I talked about in another video. As human beings, we can never reach our ideal, or our peak, or our genetic limit. It is impossible. We can always be better than whatever point we are at now. We keep inching closer, but we will never attain the ultimate ideal. We are like an asymptote curve reaching its vanishing point. An asymptote is a line that a curve approaches and gets closer and closer to, but ultimately never touches. It has no ending. Likewise, we only inch closer to our limit, but never actually make it. The endpoint is ambiguous. So we can only get close to our optimum, but never fully hit it. A similar idea holds true in our relationship with God. Just like being optimally fit is a never-ending pursuit, being Christ-like is a never-ending pursuit. The Bible always uses the language of us following God. There's no adjacent language used that implies we are ever equal to Him or we can ever stop pursuing more of Him. The implication is that we are constantly moving forward, following Him, aiming at where He may be, and that He's always ahead of us. Christianity is about chasing that perfect ideal we can never reach, but finding transcendent purpose in its pursuit nonetheless. The Christian life isn't about avoiding damnation, it is about actively pursuing glorification. Heaven is infinite because God is infinite. God isn't just infinite, but He's disparately infinite. Thus, in His house, there will be infinite, disparate things to do. Duncan poses an interesting hypothetical of how, even though there's continuity between year 10 million and 10 billion in heaven, you'll be an entirely new person by the time you get to year 10 billion, and you'll have a different group of friends and all that stuff.
You will always run out of things to do. At some point, you will have done it all. You might be able to fix this problem with some kind of amnesia system. Let's say you get bored after about 1,000 years of doing stuff. At this point, you start to lose your memories and forget what you did a few hundred years ago. By the time you're at 2 billion years, you could barely remember what you spent your time doing as a young 100 million year old angel. At this point, you've changed completely. You have different tastes, a different personality, and you spend your time doing things that you wouldn't imagine doing before. But is this really worth it? There is continuity between the young angel me and the old angel me, but is it still really me? I don't even remember the previous me existing at all. My personality is totally different too, and I'm probably hanging out with different angel friends. I don't think I'd want something like this.
While there is continuity between the you of 10 million years and the you of 10 billion years, he is again using our flawed human experience. As you can tell at this point, heaven doesn't really make any sense unless you understand human nature as posited by the Christian worldview. Unless you understand, specifically the fall. Back to the point about continuity anyways, our experiences won't be divided and segmented, but they will be rather multiplied. We will grow in communion with more and infinitely unique people. We are all so meticulously unique and disparate. This is because we come from an infinite deity who has infinite creativity. And look, I understand, this is pretty hard for us to understand, especially in our imperfected state, because infinite, we can't even really understand what infinite actually entails. But that's what the Bible says God is. It also says in Isaiah, I believe, that his ways are greater than our ways and his thoughts are greater than ours. When speaking of experiences, Duncan likes the one-for-all afterlife theory because it supplies a seemingly endless stock of new experiences. But I don't know if that's even really true. At some point, after a billion trillion years, it will end. At some point, you'll stop experiencing all the new lives because the sun's gonna blow up and we're all gonna die. Or some other catastrophic event you choose. The point is, no one thinks that humanity is gonna persist forever. Oh yeah, the one-for-all theory is basically the theory that we will experience every single person's life. He describes it like we're in a room with hundreds of thousands of TVs and we're watching them all and experiencing them all at the same time.
The idea that we're all one consciousness has the connotation of being a bit hippy-dippy. It's often associated with meditation practice, or other techniques that supposedly reveal this truth. But this idea is actually pretty old. It's part of the system of reincarnation in some schools of Hinduism, where deep down we're all God or Krishna. It also emerged a few times in the Western intellectual tradition. Schopenhauer talked about this kind of thing a lot, for example. And some pretty famous physicists have described similar things. Sometimes this idea is called open individualism. You are every moment of experience on everyone's timeline. The fact that some other entity is instantiating consciousness makes them identical to you. This might seem a little wacky at first, but stick with me here. Our identification with ourselves as one particular human stops, and we return to the ocean of being. But what would this be like? Would we experience all conscious experiences that all beings are having simultaneously? Almost like you're sitting in front of a bunch of screens, watching every single experience play out. This is a pretty tricky thing to wrap your head around, and it's unclear whether this state of being would be positive, negative, or neutral. But you might also consider the fact that right now, you're only one instantiation of consciousness. Maybe instead of returning to some default, where you're everything at once, you cycle through every instance of consciousness. This picture might look something like the short story The Egg by Andrew Weir. In this story, the main character, you, die in a car crash. You meet God, who explains that you've already reincarnated loads of times before. In your next incarnation, you'll be a Chinese peasant girl in 540 AD. In fact, you've actually been reincarnated as every single human being who has ever lived. You were Abraham Lincoln, Adolf Hitler, and Jesus. You were also every Holocaust victim and every follower of Jesus.
Another problem with this is that it won't really feel all that novel after some time. Even the most disparate people in the most disparate circumstances will have their experience converge at some point. In other words, if you experience what it's like being a rich man enough times, this feeling will probably start to mesh with being a poor woman from a completely different climate, temperature, ethnicity, etc. There's a lot of people who currently exist and have existed in the past. If you live the life of 1,000 kings and 1,000 peasants, at some point they're gonna pretty much converge. In heaven, however, the new things that you'll experience will quite literally be endless because God is endless. And this isn't the same as even 1 billion different human lives because the human experience tends to homogenize at some point. Now, this theory does posit in a sense that our soul sort of hits a soft reset and we experience it as if it were new, which does sort of address the issue of converging experiences, but even still, it doesn't retain the potency and still even the diversity of the experience in heaven.
Okay, so here's a heaven I think would actually be desirable. You can hang out there as long as you want, but the door is open. Once you're satisfied with all the things you've done, you can peace out. This scenario seems pretty good.
God's house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. We will, please, Lord willing, be discovering more and more about God the longer we're there. When we think we've reached the edge, it just gets bigger. There are things about God that only we know, and there are things about God that only He knows about us. A new name, for one, is referenced in Revelation. We'll have a new name, but only God and ourselves will know it. Sort of like our little secret, you know? Like friends have their little secrets. We'll have our own secrets to sort of exemplify the closeness of our relationship with God. And on that note, our experience will be personally fine-tuned for us because He knows our inner soul better than anyone else. It will be infinitely unique and satisfying at every turn. So no, heaven won't be boring. If anything, it will be more and more interesting the longer you stay there. Duncan talks about how we will all be singing in heaven, and I actually kind of like that example, so I'm going to extrapolate on it for a bit. We will have notes in the heavenly choirs only our voice can sing. Not only is this an experience worth embarking on forever, I would like nothing more than to experience this forever. And I honestly can't think of a greater conception for an afterlife. We will be united to the ultimate source of goodness. You wouldn't even want to peace out, even if that was an option. This is also why hell is bad, by the way. Hell sucks not because of some Hollywood idea of being in fire forever, even if that might be part of it or it might not be part of it, I don't know. It's ultimately painful because God is responsible for every good thing you've ever felt in existence, because again, He is goodness itself. Hell is willfully chosen eternal separation from God, and thus goodness, and that is why hell sucks. It is completely devoid of goodness. Because hell is separation from God, and Christians believe that we have free will, it must exist. It's a necessary consequence of our necessarily eternal soul. And since this soul is made eternal, and we didn't choose heaven, the necessary result is that we are away from Him in hell. So yeah, heaven S++++ tier, and hell F-, tier. Duncan, as far as I can tell, isn't a Christian, and his video, by his own account, isn't an exhaustive account of the possibilities of all afterlives. He didn't go into every single conception of heaven, so I didn't really expect him to understand or talk about this point of view of heaven. He went through a lot of conceptions of the afterlife, which means that almost necessarily he didn't do a deep dive of any particular one. So please understand that this video isn't a video dunking on him with facts and logic or something. He just made a video and that was the catalyst for me to actually go about and articulate my views as fully as I'm capable of at this moment. Duncan and I are actually decent friends, and I have a lot of respect for him as a fellow Canadian content creator who went to school in Ontario. And finally, this is just my own understanding and perception of heaven. This is basically just some large theological extrapolation based off my current understanding of Christianity. I'm not claiming that this is the way to interpret heaven, I'm just saying that this is the way I currently understand it, and this is my best guess at what it's like. I hope this video was at least interesting to you, even if you disagree with it, even if you're not a Christian and you somehow made it this far into the video. Oh, another inspiration for this video is I just finished reading the Invincible comics series. This doesn't get like my Christian approval rating or anything like that, but if you're willing to, skip through the some explicit scenes and gore doesn't bother you, I think it's worth checking out. Especially if you like action, adventure, superhero sort of media. Anyways, Mark, the main character, he's basically immortal given the fact that he's a Viltrumite, and I thought it was really cool how he can fly. Untethered flight might not be the most useful superpower, but it's certainly like the most fun superpower that I can think of. And he also gets like randomly really buff around the last 10 or 15 chapters. So in my silly imagination, I started wondering, would I be a muscular guy that can fly in heaven? Like Mark? Not Mark in the Bible, but Mark, one of the main characters of Invincible? I'm not sure. I just thought I'd mention that because that was one of the inspirations for making this video. Let me know, do you think we'll be able to fly in heaven? I think it's actually pretty likely, considering, Jesus, he ascended into heaven, which implies, vertical elevation. So perhaps if he wanted to, we could have done some horizontal, lateral movements. And if you can move up and down, left and right, and presumably forward and backward as well, then you just have untethered flight. I'm just spitballing stuff now. Regardless, what's in heaven will be much better than whatever can be concocted by Rob Odenkirk. Did I say Rob Odenkirk? That's like the Better Call Saul actor. Robert Kirkman. They sound kind of similar. You can't blame me. Anyways, I've gone on talking for long enough. Thank you for watching. If you want to know some of the stuff I have to say about hell, I've made 2 videos. One is in Full Metal Alchemist, one is in Better Call Saul, that talk about hell. Maybe I could elaborate on that and make that its own separate video if this video, for whatever reason, people like it. But yeah, that all depends on you guys. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll catch you all next time. Peace.